Okay, hey everybody, welcome back to the Art2Life podcast. Today, I am really excited to share with you John C. John is a art writer and the creator of two books, Disrupted Realism and More Disruption. His second book, chronicling an entire movement of art that's occurring now, and this book is not yet out as the release of this podcast, but in October. But we're going to dive in today and learn more about what this book's about, what disruption realism is, and John's unique perspective on art today. John, thanks so much for being here.
Always a pleasure to chat. Thanks, Nick.
First of all, John, where are you located? Place yourself for us.
I'm zooming you from Cambria, California. Cambria is on the central coast. We're about 10 minutes from Hearst Castle, and I moved here in retirement 5 years ago.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, that's lovely.
It's a small town full of pine trees, and you might see, if I put the camera on the window, you might see some wild turkeys. So it's real different from the city living, that was my earlier life.
Yeah. So you've been at hard work producing this, I would call it a volume of contemporary artists' work. You must be, I don't know. I mean, the hard work's done, the heavy lifting's done, but how are you doing? How are you feeling after this big push? It's just been amazing to see the first book and now the second one. How are you doing?
Well, maybe I should tell you a little bit about how the second book happened, because you were so generous with the first book. I know you talked about it and got your readers familiar with it. You were a big help with that. And I should tell the audience that Nicholas wrote the foreword to this book. So he knew something about the project and previewed it and has had things to say along the line. But there's kind of a funny story about how this book came about. I honestly, after the first book, I just was tired. A book is a big project. And I thought,
I can't imagine.
That's great. Let's put that to bed. I'll move on and do some other things. I'll do some watercolor paintings. But the first book did well enough that the owner of the publishing company called me, to talk about what I do a second book. And we are about 40 minutes from Vandenberg Air Force Base. And the publisher called me on a day they were testing jets over our house. So I went out on the deck with my cell phone, and honestly, the entire call, I heard his voice, I heard him come on, and then I heard F-16s, I heard, overhead, and I only heard a couple minutes of the call. And when it was over, he said, well, will you sign up? Will you do the second book? And I just thought, I don't have the heart to tell him I didn't hear his pitch. I think I'll go ahead. Sure, I'll do the second book. And that's really how it came about. And then, of course, during the writing the book, COVID came along. So that, I kind of think it as a project that helped keep me sane during the difficult period of stay at home. So in that sense, it was a good thing.
Yeah. And just to why don't we just kind of give a little, brief overview of what this book's about, because it's controversial, it's new, it's different, it's many things. And I was reading some of the contributors to the new book, and I just love how it's open to interpretation a little bit. Where you're going, and this gathering or this assemblage of creatives, what this means and why now.
Well, to give you context, like you, I'm a painter. And I think and I work like a painter. And I bring that up because I have a tremendous tendency to never get things right the first time. So my first book was a learning process, and I'm proud of it. I think it's a cool book. But I learned a lot in writing that book. And I also got a lot of reactions. I heard from a lot of people. And one thing I heard a number of times was kind of unintentional. People would say to me, well, John, in talking about the whole idea of disruption, wow, I mean, did you know that, 2016 was coming in politics, and COVID and climate and all these things, it is such a world of disruption. It feels like you really, kind of knew that was coming with your book. And I kind of gently correct people. And I say, no, I didn't know that was coming. I think most people didn't know any of those things were coming. But I do believe that artists are sometimes the canaries in the coal mine of life. I think artists have great intuition. They're paying attention to the world around them, to the things that are happening. And so there was some intuition in that book of some of the things we're now facing. And the other thing that happened after the first book is I changed my idea of disruption a little bit. The first book, it's really formal. In other words, I was really looking at the way things were painted. How is paint applied? How are the compositions? How does abstraction make its way into the artwork? And while I was writing this book, a friend of mine used the phrase for the first time. He said, well, you also are dealing with social disruption. And I can see there are more and more artists in this book that they're clearly making a social comment, whether it's about race or immigration or queer identity, all the hot social issues of our time. These were also animating the paintings, and I have to include a social dimension in a lot of what I'm calling disrupted. So that's how the second book evolved. It opened up a little more broadly in its theme.
Yeah. How did you source these artists, and did you visit many of them, or how did I imagine if you did the first book that it would be easier, that calling card, because I don't think necessarily the artists that are in the book would consider themselves part of the book ahead of time. They're not actively calling themselves disruptors, but you have a criteria, that the lens with which you were looking at artists. And I'm wondering what that was, and how did you reach out to artists, and how did you gather them?
Well, I'll tell you my method in a minute, but I'll also tell you an inspiration. I remember, and I've told you how Nathan Oliveira, my professor, was a great inspiration to me. I was so enchanted the first time I ever went to his house and saw that all of the chairs around the dining room table didn't match. They had just gone to different antique stores. If they liked a chair, it went around the table. And that's how I curate. If I see the work of an artist that gets to me, that speaks to me and enchants me in some way, I'm going to include that artist. And I think later down the road, maybe I'll break down what took me into that work. Why was I attracted? What's that artist trying to say? But I go with my gut on what I like. But practically speaking, as far as putting together, I want to tell you something about the book I think I will take some flack for. And that is that the book was curated on Instagram. Because during COVID, really hard to do a studio visit. Many galleries and museums closed. And I used the save feature on Instagram and made lists and looked at hundreds of artists. And I think it's both a strength and a weakness of the book. The strength is that I have artists from Bermuda and Europe and the United States. It's a more broadly international book. I think I have 20 overseas artists in it. So Instagram makes that possible. Maybe it's a weakness in the sense that a studio visit's always better. And I would studio visit's always bitter. That was like a Freudian slip. But always best to see things in person. But I looked as hard as I could. And one other concept I want to put out there for the book is that the book is really kind of a wish fulfillment of a group show that will never be. Because I think if every one of these artists were to try to ship a painting to one location, we'd have a 6-figure shipping charge before the doors even open to the show. But you can tell anybody in the world, get me a high quality JPEG of your image and send it to me, and we'll be able to publish it. So you can make a group show that might be impossible in any other situation.
Wow, yes, of course. It's so interesting how you're using a traditional form, but you've created it with this new possibility with technology.
I have my complaints about internet and social media, like I'm sure you do. I know its imperfections well, but it has really made my career. I mean, I started as a blogger on the Huffington Post. So I was with a digital newspaper first, and that gave me that kind of tendency to take my overview from the net rather than from my real world experiences. And I think it's turned out to be a strength. It also makes for, I'll come up with a phrase here, what I call kind of a glorious inconsistency. And in your foreword, I mean, you said something about this. You said that it's often maybe, uncertain or difficult to tell how these things come together. And
Mm.
that's the nature of looking at art on the net, is that the individuality surges, and you see this kind of atomized art world with so many ideas
Mm.
and so many themes and so many different points of view, but yet a book can bring them together. And I want to tell you about another common theme of the book. As you know, I use an interview format. Each artist has a short interview, and I ask about their influences. And counting from the first book into the second book, when I asked about influences, one name came up more than any other name, and that was Jenny Saville.
Yeah.
And that's why I worked and worked and worked to get her permission, and I finally got it. But that's why the book opens with Jenny Saville as the great disruptor, because I realized she meant so much to so many of the people in the book, and you can see it play its way through their art.
Yeah, that's interesting. And she was selected by the book itself to be almost the poster child for it.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, we all need people to look up to. Inspiration is a big part of being an artist. Who do you respect? And she was very highly respected. Other people mentioned Gerhard Richter.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm understanding that European art has played a big role in these developments. Going back to modernism, many people mentioned Francis Bacon as a modernist that had some of these ideas. But then it really it spreads out from there. They are the peaks of the influence.
Yes, yes. So I'm curious because I've never asked you, and I know that you had that long run where you were writing for the Huffington Post and kind of like what I'm just curious what you were obviously making art and you're an artist and you're a painter, but you started how did you get going in that? I'm just curious. And what did it how did it develop for you? I mean, you worked how many years were you doing blogs for the Huffington Post?
Well, I started in 2010, and a little bit of context. I'm married to a former newspaper editor, so newspapers are a part of our family. My wife was a front page editor for the Union Tribune in San Diego, which, by the way, has been sold 8 times since we got married. So the growth of my career as a writer corresponds with the downturn, with the problems in the newspaper industry, because the very first art piece I ever wrote to be published in a newspaper, I sent to the Press Enterprise in Riverside. They didn't have an art critic, and I sent them a sample, and they said, "Great, write us a piece of criticism." And by the time the editor sent it back to me, it had been dumbed down to some bullet points, and he gave it a cute title, and it didn't sound like my writing anymore. And I said, "Keep your $50. I don't think I want to be your art critic." I was very, discouraged. But then someone reached out to me and said, "You need to contact the critic Peter Frank, because he's going to be joining the Huffington Post, and they're going to have, online art criticism." And I was one of their earliest writers, so I rode kind of the rise of the Huffington
Um,
Post as an unpaid blogger. And of course, people told me, "Don't do that. That's you shouldn't write without being paid." But the model has changed, because writing that way gave me what every writer wants. It gave me an audience. And I had crazy things happen. Like I wrote a blog about iPhone fine art photography that ended up on the front page of America Online when it was still a bigger company, and I had 1 million page views in one day.
yeah.
And things like that don't happen anymore. But anyways, the decline of the newspapers and the rise of blogging, those are the intersections of my career.
Wow. Wow.
A,
And was
a
it
blog a week for 7 years.
were you going to shows a lot for or was it some of it was just you putting together ideas that you had about art?
Not as much as a conventional critic. I mean, and again, to give it a context, let's say that you or I were traditional, conventional newspaper critics, and there's fewer and fewer of those. But your editor would assign you a topic, and you probably would have a word count, and you'd know, can you have a color photo or not? Does the budget allow it? And you'd write within those parameters, and the editor would give it oversight, and it would be published. Whereas with blogging, I had a wonderful editor named Kimberly Brooks, who was also a painter. And honestly, I think she gave my first pieces a glance. And if it wasn't actionable, she would push the publish button. So I wrote about the artist I wanted to write about, the length I wanted to write, with the images or slideshow I wanted to insert. And it really was incredible creative freedom for a writer. It was a writer's paradise.
And you never were paid for this job.
No, no. And people ask me, John, how expensive is your writing? And I say, well, it ranges from free to very expensive. It just depends on the context. But what happened was like a game of pinball, where one thing bounces off another. Every time I wrote about an artist, that artist would say, well, you really want to talk to this other artist who's a friend of mine. And that would be the next interview, and it would keep going and going. And I also began writing mainly about representational figurative art for a couple of reasons. But one was that it was the low-hanging fruit that at the time there wasn't enough good writing being done about it. So I had my own path. No editor was telling me, write about this type of art. But I wrote about my friends and my friends' friends, and then the friends of my friends' friends, and then their therapist daughter's dog's friend, eventually. Just kept following every lead.
It's so the price of freedom, right? I mean, it's you can't it makes so much sense that you just did this for free for freedom.
Everybody listening, we're all passionate about art. It's the most idealistic thing in my life, and there's plenty of compromises. But it was kind of nice to not make money, because I've certainly written for art magazines or other publications. And when you write for an art magazine, you often know that the gallery who's showing that artist will have a full page ad, and they might be upset if you say what they don't expect you're going to say. And on the Huffington Post, I think I was selling weight loss drugs and, things like that. So there was nobody that cared if I liked or disliked somebody or something.
Ah, interesting. Wow. And it led you to producing these amazing books, and I know you have a following, which is a great way to this is your own project now, and getting that out is everything.
Absolutely. And I have, maybe this is a bit of a bird walk, but all kinds of opinions about art journalism and art writing. And I think one is I'm very, very tired of art stories being about this painting sold at a record for auction, or this very expensive work of art, brought this record or something like that. That belongs in the Wall Street Journal, because that's finance. And what really interests me, honestly, is just painting and artists. And I love a good artist profile. And that's what I read when I read magazines. I want to learn about the person behind the art. And it's what I try to write as well.
Yeah, yeah. So can you kind of summarize what disrupted realism is, what the subject of the book is for
Yes.
those who haven't seen the first book or who are waiting for the second?
If you haven't seen the first book, there it is. I'm going to give because I'm a teacher, I'll give a simple version, and then maybe I'll complicate it a little bit.
Okay.
Simple version is that in disrupted realism, you see other ingredients transforming or changing the style. That's maybe a very, very simple definition. Now let's flesh that out a little bit. When I was going to art school, and similar, the time you went to art school, I think you're a little bit younger, but there was very, very little good instruction on what you and I would call skilled realism, that long tradition that goes back to academic art, that goes back into Europe. And, you had to teach yourself that kind of painting, or maybe at a large college, let's say, there was one veteran instructor who hid in their office with a bottle of vodka sometimes, that could teach you, how to draw like Raphael, let's say. But that began to change in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s because of the New York Academy of Art and the Slade School, and also PAFA. There were a number of schools where representation was stronger than at other schools. And so you began to get a new generation of artists that have what I call the chops of realism, that have these tremendous skills that really can give you a strong traditional image if they want to. But what I began to notice, and this is where disrupted realism began, is that many of those artists with those capabilities said, well, yes, I can do that, but I would like to make it my own. I'd like to add an element of, and Nick, fill in the blank, abstraction, you know, unbalance, something anti-classical, something where the color is unexpected. They take a formal element of the painting and begin to violate their expectations. And this is why Gerhard Richter is one artist that I think people cite as an influence, because he made, famously, he went through, full photorealism all the way to squeegee abstraction and everything in between, and changed our idea about what's the relationship between those things. I think he taught us it's all painting.
Yes.
And that the abstraction and representation didn't necessarily have to be at odds with each other. They could, well, as a friend of mine says, they could have sex with each other and, do something in between.
Yes, yes. And I love thinking about, there's some element or some attribute of a realistic picture that is exploited. And I think whether that's proportions or whether that's color, I mean, some of your artists, it's realism, but the color is just different, right? And that we aren't, it's not expected. And I'm curious if you feel that some of the need to be disruptive or to do something is about stopping scroll, right? Like scroll stopping. We see so much that it all runs together. And many of the artists, much of the work in the book is, we've never seen anything like it. And so it seems extra, it's just pushed more than maybe it would have 50 years ago. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, it's very related. And I think, as I say in the first book, I call us, our society, the most distracted society in the history of the world. And I really do believe that, because we have such a glut of imagery. And when you step into the painting studio now and you're a painter, do you use photo references? Do you use web content of some kind, maybe even including videos as your source? Do you use your memory? Do you have a still life on the table? Do you use your memory of great works of art you've seen in museums? Do you use all of the above? There's so much material that you can put into the recipes of your art that it's overwhelming. And that's why I think a really, really powerful skill that painters have to develop, that everyone needs to develop now, we all need to curate. And by that, I mean, at a certain point, we have to say, there's so much that I'm seeing. There's so much out there. What do I see? What do I care about? What is the image or type of imagery that I land on that it's meaningful for me? So it takes a kind of decisiveness in the studio or in your life. And it's an important quality to have.
It's actually something that I coach a lot around, but it's a process of improving discernment. That we intuit it maybe, or we have a sense of what the things are maybe in the beginning, but it's over time that we get more and more clear. We leave things out, we include things, we make things more prominent. Have you found that what you're talking about has anything to do with maturation? That an artist can come onto the scene, maybe not even an artist, and start putting together things, and it's just so surprising and different that the work has a quality about it that elevates it. I mean, I know you work with a lot of young artists are in your book, all the whole range, but do you get a sense of the quality or the depth of the work as it pertains to someone's longevity as an artist, like how long they've been making art? And
oh, well, I think that maturity is a huge advantage. I mean, we're all different. We have different timing. I know I think I've mentioned to you that as a young man, I worked in the studio with Jean-Michel Basquiat. I helped make, some of the canvases for a show. So he was a comet. He launched early and had a real insightful genius in his 20s. I'm the other way. I just published, or I'm about to publish the second book, and I'm 66. And a friend of mine, a high school friend of mine on Facebook, was kind of chiding me. He said, John, I thought you were retired. And I just said, no, I'm finally doing what I want. But it
Yeah.
took 7 years of blogging, and I've been painting 50 years now, and I've been going to museums all my life. I think I've had to arrive at these things. And I think for painters, when you're maybe new or fresh or young, there might be an inclination toward novelty. And by novelty, I mean you try
Hmm.
something that's trendy, or it's being talked about, or it's
Yes.
what
Yes.
I sometimes call the fashion show of the art world. What's the fashion show right now? And let me, step into that. Whereas with time and maturity and with those hard choices, you begin to refine your own aesthetic and your own painting, your own practice. I had a wonderful exercise as a student where I was studying with an abstract painter, and I had a big painting that was a mess. And this teacher came around to my canvas, and I said to him, well, I said I was thinking of Van Gogh's color over here, and gosh, I tried to put a Cezanne figure over here, and then I was doing, I was naming all these names and doing all these things. And he said, okay, he said, I'll be back in 30 minutes, and when I come back in 30 minutes, I want you to show me one thing that you like. And he left. He went away, and he left me there sitting with my painting that I couldn't stand. But I did the assignment. I looked at it and I looked at it. And, he came back and I pointed to one corner and I said, well, I kind of like the color down here. He said, great. He said, hang on to that. Now start a new painting.
Yes.
And he was kind of telling me, you gotta be searching for these things and pick them up along the way.
Boy, that's really interesting. I give that, I don't know how many times a week, that idea, that advice, that the clues of what you are going to be making, the amazing work is in a corner maybe of something you've made previously. And you can kind of tell, right? It's like, and other people can too. It's not just completely random. There's if you like us, there's you can feel potency, I think. I mean, not always, but that's really interesting. I was scrolling through the different artists, and I thought it'd be fun to maybe just dive into a few of them. Marcus Jansen stuck out for me, and I just maybe just tell us a little bit about him and what he's making and why he's in this book.
Well, Marcus Jansen is a guy with a remarkable background. He is part German. He's part African American. I believe his mother was Jamaican, to get that right. He grew up both in New York and in Europe, so he had cultural, exchanges with both places. And he also spent a fair amount of time in the military. And he came out of the Iraq conflict with what he later discovered was PTSD. He, had some problems that came from the military service,
Mm.
and it really was through painting. He started at taking art as a therapy, and then took off as an artist. That he really got a grip on what mattered to him. He also was very influenced by graffiti art on the streets of New York. That really spoke to him at the time he got started as an artist. And as a mature artist today, I think he's got the best of both worlds, because he's a very daring, exciting painter who often uses paint in, unexpected, spontaneous ways, like an abstract expressionist, and yet he makes images. There's a narrative, there's a story, there's very often social content that deals with the image of power, for example, or our colonial past, or the issues of race. So I just feel like he has a full toolbox and a very interesting life that he brings to the studio.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that must be so cool for you to discover all these backstories, of you see the work. Like I read a little bit about him, but you see the pictures and there's just a depth about it, and it makes you curious. Do you just want to learn more about how this art is made? I mean, the human experience behind it that generates this kind of work, that sampling, the military and the power, and I can see it just makes sense now.
People ask me what's the importance of a backstory. And in the way you just spoke to me, I think you have your organization right. You start with the art. You look for the art that just grabs you and makes you want to have a conversation with that artist. And then you can take it further and learn who they are and where they came from. But it has to come from the art. You have to start with compelling paintings to draw you into all of that. And there's always something there.
Another artist that I thought was really interesting was Justin Mortimer.
Oh my gosh. And how about the quote that he has there in the book? Someone gave him the advice, paint what you're afraid of. He's an incredible colorist. And it's both garish and seductive, both. They're kind of acidic colors. They bring together both strangeness, but also everyday life. And there definitely is a kind of a feeling of something ominous that's there in the work. But, the son of a military man, he had a very great early career. He did portraits of some of the British royalty, and now has found his way into this, incredible kind of on the edge of expressionism, I think is something you'd say about his work.
And were you able to, so you don't necessarily get to meet most of these artists, correct?
You know what? It's almost like the book now gives me a kind of a social card of people I would like to meet. Over time, I hope I'll meet many more of them, and I'll try to do some book signings. There are a couple of shows in the offing where maybe people will travel and we'll get together. But I really, in person, have only met a handful of the artists.
It must be so interesting to be in conversation with them about this, and what they're when these books come out. It just must be incredible because they're going to be together with so many artists that they probably aren't even having any awareness of.
And again, and I talked about the book as a group show, but maybe also the group as a conversation, the book as a conversation. I don't doubt for a second that artists in this book will make one or two new artist best friends because of something they see between the covers. And maybe a couple shows curated by other people other than myself will come out of it because they'll see new relationships between the artists in the book. I also think that a wonderful thing this book does, I've had a couple people say to me, they say, my God, John, I am so thrilled to be in a book with Jenny Saville. And I think, well, maybe a rising tide lifts all boats. There's an artist you respect as a serious artist. And maybe if you're an artist, you feel like, well, you're just at the early part of your career, you're an emerging artist. There you are between the same two covers, having a conversation between your works of art. God, I think that's a beautiful thing.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's wonderful. The opportunities that the book provides.
As for readers of the book too, that I always tell people these books are not authoritative. It's not a tome, right? I would expect, for example, you to go through it and say, this work thrills me. This work, not so much. Why did John choose this one? I'd expect all kinds of reactions from everybody that engages with the book. And that's also part of what, I hope it'll generate is, everybody will have their own feelings about the combinations and about the artists.
Yeah. You've looked at so much work and you're tracking so many artists. And I know that, we have all kinds of listeners here, and a lot of listeners are just entering their own creativity and getting things going, and they're in different stages. But can you speak to just maybe some advice you would have for how people can drop into, learn and find their way in this? It's just so overwhelming. I remember when I was figuring stuff out, I would look at these kinds of books and I don't know, incredibly inspiring, but also disempowering at the same time.
Well, I mean, first of all, don't compare yourself. When you see an artist that you admire, just be inspired. That's all you need is the inspiration. Just, I love this artist. You don't need to make yourself insecure. Something I've done since I was new in this field, since I was a young man, is, people say to me, do you have a favorite artist? And I tell them, well, sometimes for a week or two, I do. I get very, very interested in someone I'm writing about, or just someone I've come across, and I learn everything I can about them. It's like speed dating. And then another artist catches my eye. So that's
Yeah.
another advantage of maturity. I've looked at so many artists over time. I've had so many artists of the week that it kind of piles up, and you just keep doing that, and it will help you sort out. You find that there are traits or tendencies among the artists that you keep learning about and coming back to.
There's so many different people in this book, so many artists from all over the world, and and they're all managing to create something unique and different. Is what are some of the commonalities that you see, or maybe there's none at all, but what do you think prompts people? I mean, how do people do this?
I think the commonality is idealism and
Hmm.
believing in the power of art and uncynically doing that. I was talking with one of the artists in the book the other day. We just had a Zoom call, and she was expressing what I'm sure many of the people in your programs are feeling. It's like, well, I'm well into this. I'm developing my art. How will I take that next step of maybe being with a gallery or a better gallery or being in a show or, professionally, how do I advance? And I was telling her, I said, I was looking around behind her on the Zoom camera, you've got a studio and it looks like you're painting quite a bit and it looks like you have a roof over your head. I said, you're doing well because there's different kinds of luxuries in life. And some people want to have a Mercedes in their driveway. And some people want to go to Europe once a year, the things we call wealth. And I think it's a tremendous wealth to have a painting on the easel and have the time to paint and feel like you're doing what you love. That's an incredible luxury. And I have so much respect for anyone that is doing that. And let's start with that, right?
Yeah, yeah. You have a tremendous amount going, just to show up, the opportunity just to show up.
You're doing it. And I also, maybe a thing that I've learned from my own career, I once had somebody say to me, well, art critics are failed painters, which maybe that's why I call myself an art writer, but they were kind of bringing it up to me. John, are you a failed painter? Well, sort of. I mean, I guess I'm a failed painter because I spend more time writing than painting. But what I tell people in this field is it's a wonderful big field. And if you are a painter right now, maybe next month you should be curating. I mean, maybe you need to give a group show in an empty space in your neighborhood, or maybe you need to write a blog or an interview about another artist that you admire, or maybe you need to find a way to volunteer at a small museum as a docent, or even join the board. You should try all of the different roles in the art community, both for your social life, for your mental health, and also to expand your view of art. And that's what art is really meant to me. It's this kind of expanded art world that writing has brought me is the most precious thing I honestly have.
What are some of the couple of the bigger things that you've learned by this massive curation, that you've done?
I think I've learned that the biggest struggle that people are having right now in our society is knowing themselves.
Mm,
Think about it, Nick. A
yes,
couple hundred
yes.
years ago, your dad was a fisherman, you were going to be a fisherman. And then the Industrial Revolution came along. And fast forward to now, people are flummoxed deciding on their own identity and deciding on their own values and what matters to them. In painting, you have this luxury of doing a lot of soul searching, of looking at what's on the canvas and thinking about yourself and looking inside through your own artwork. So I think what I have learned by looking at a lot of artists, I've learned a lot about going to the backstory, the people that make art and who they are. And I found qualities I admire tremendously. And it's also helped me reflect on myself. I've developed my own identity. And my daughters say, kind of kiddingly or lovingly, they say, Dad, the way you are about art, it's the way that some dads are about jazz music or cars or wine or sports. And I say, absolutely, because I think you need something to go crazy over that kind of keeps you from going crazy. You need to be all in with your passion in life. And then that helps you build your identity, helps you solve that problem.
Yes, yes. I really relate to, and I think it's true that the people are struggling out there. right now. We got through COVID, and I think there's a bit of an existential crisis here. I think there is a quest that we are all on or sensing we need to be on to learn who we are and where we're going. I think there's been a resurgence in, I'm at sort of the front end where I'm talking to a lot of people that are interested in art, and I'm really starting to talk about art making as a process of becoming yourself, as a way to learn who you are. That is what it used to be. I could show you how to paint, use color, but I think it's right now is it's about creativity and discovering your authenticity.
And you have to make so many decisions as an artist, and the decisions are your own. I was reading recently about how more summer camps have therapists on their staff because kids come to summer camp anxious and confused and upset. And I think back, I used to just, leap into summer camp and, jump into a canoe, and that was summer camp. Complicated
Yeah.
times. And but that is, again, that's a positive value of art, is that ability to reflect on yourself and to take time away. And also, it's why caring too much about success can be a tremendous distraction. I mean, absolutely. I applaud you and I respect you if you're selling some paintings and having some shows, and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. But you don't want to forget kind of the reason that you're there in the first place, which is hopefully because you just love art. Uh, I was in New York recently. I went back and saw some shows, and I like to be a fly on the wall. I was listening to people there, and I heard a conversation between an art dealer and a collector that went on about 15 minutes. I was, listening like this. And the whole conversation was the art collector saying, I bought this artist's work when it was inexpensive, and then I flipped it and sold it for more. And the art dealer was,
Yeah.
huh? This went on for 15 minutes with 10 different artists. And I bought this artist early and then made a lot of money. And I got really sad thinking, I'm waiting for the sentence about, here's why I love that person's work. Or, here's how I've watched them develop and really enjoyed their development. I was waiting for that kind of conversation that we as
Mm.
painters really value. I wasn't hearing it from that collector or that dealer.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, there's such a commodity here.
It's hurt
And
all of
and
us.
there always has been. Anything that's new and different is attractive and seductive, and it's something to talk about. I mean, when I look through the PDF of the book and some of the artists, I catch myself stopping at things that are more different, things that I've never seen before. For sure, I read all about it, and I get drawn in. I guess that's just a human nature a little bit, but yeah, that the monetary, the pricing, I think there's a ego part of this, right? That this is a way that people can, they're not making the thing, but they get to say, they get to hold up the thing and say, look, I bought that. I bought that. I knew enough. I'm like that. I bought that. And then I sold it and made more. It's just having like a bumper sticker to your life to make yourself feel significant.
As someone, here I am, I've been a retired art professor, art book writer, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to maybe say something surprising, but I think that art is overvalued. And we're all, I think, offended by the disconnect in our society of income inequality and, the vast wealth that's at the top of our society. And art is often becoming a symbol of that now, with the prices that collectors or museums pay. And I can imagine why young people hear the word art and just say, well, that's irrelevant to me, or it's something for rich people. It's something that's, a different part of the world. And I wish I could correct that and
Yeah.
detach from that dynamic.
Yes, yes. Can you, there's a couple artists that I saw in the book, but I'm wondering, I know you know all the artists in the book. Is there a story or two or a couple of artists you want to draw our attention to that were, just particularly interesting to you that you couldn't get out of your mind?
Well, I'll do something maybe related to that that'll get me into that. Since putting the book together, I follow the careers of these different artists, and it's so amazing what they do in their lives. And I want to give you a few examples.
Yeah.
One of the artists in the book is Joseph Lee. I think he goes by Joey Lee. He was just nominated for an Emmy for his role in the Netflix series Beef. He's an artist, but he plays an artist in this Netflix series. And he's having a show in I think Tokyo coming up. But what a thing! He's a very, very serious artist, and then he's going far as an actor at the same time. So that blows my mind. Kathy Lau, who is LIAO, just today received a Joan Mitchell Fellowship for $60,000 that she'll get over a period of several years, to support her art. Timothy Robert Smith, who's the last artist in the book, he recently had one of his paintings made into a giant digitally printed mural that is wrapping around a stadium in Florida. It's over 400 feet long.
What?
So, just what people are accomplishing blows my mind. The energy and the inspiration that all these artists have.
That's incredible. And I don't know how you print out a thing to wrap around a stadium and who thought of that and what's the work like and why is it on a stadium? I'm just so curious.
Well, his work is about figures in space in a very, very dynamic way. They're very exciting to look at, and they're a little bit, you tilt your head different ways as you look, and they present kind of speed and movement. So it would make a mural that would keep your eyes going, I think would be my
Yeah.
it would visually excite you as you walk past it.
Yes. The artist Anthony Peyton Young really interested me. Incredible work. He says through painting, drawing, ceramics, and collage, which is incredible, right? Like all those things. I mean, I'm still trying to get to sculpture. I explored methods of memorializing healing, Black intimacy, and the spaces we use to activate these actions against white supremacy. The work, it's so stirring to me, and it opens up a world that I don't know at all, and that's what so many of the artists do in here. But I'm just curious, what was his story and what was he like to work with and talk with? And
Well, if you read his interview, I've traded a little email with him. He obviously had talent as a young man and then kind of found a patron, somebody who believed in him and helped him get lessons. I should mention he recently had a fellowship at the Bemis Center. I think it's BEMIS. I hope I have the state right. I believe it's in Iowa. So he's working with a community. But Nick, you characterized his art correctly. I mean, he's made portraits that are really collaged together. They're multiple portraits, all of Black Americans who have died in violent shootings, particularly in police-related shootings. And the idea is, I don't want what to say about the idea. It's straightforward. It's memorialization. It's tries to reconcile himself with these people and with these events. But it's as if the force of the idea grows with the number of identities in one portrait. And they're breathtaking, and they're very, very moving, and they're quite tragic.
yeah,
I don't know what else to say.
yes, it's like they carry all these people within them. So it's like a portrait, but it's like a cascade of portraits in one portrait. And it's just, I think that's what is so moving about it, and there's a history there, but it's a singular image, right? That summarizes all that suffering and
Singular
so
image.
powerful.
The titles have every person's name there in the title, and the series is Say Their Names. So it's a way of keeping alive everything that those tragedies can tell us. And, there it is mixed in with, there's plenty of work in the book, which is maybe more upbeat and bright and has a completely different mood, but
Yes.
obviously a moral weight to what he's doing in this series.
Yes. We'll provide links, you guys, for this book, but when is the official date and how can people get on the wait list for it and all that?
Okay, well, first of all, if Nick, if you're in my area, if you come to my house, I have my copy because they airshipped a few out, and I have one. So come do some wine tasting. I'll show it to you.
Oh,
But to get a book sent in the mail, to get it on Amazon, the official release date is October 28th, and it will be about 2 months later in Europe. There's going to be European distribution as well, but October 28th, and I'm going to be doing a public book signing at Sue Greenwood Fine Art in
oh,
Laguna Beach. They have a tradition there called First Thursdays, where you can walk from gallery to gallery in Laguna. It's glorious. Usually get great weather down there. And from 6 to 9 on November 2nd, I'll be there signing books. Come say hello if you're in Southern
wow.
California. And we
Wow,
should
that's great.
chat to them. Yeah.
Are you friends with Sue? How did you connect to Sue Greenwood Gallery? I love that gallery.
He did a signing for Disrupted Realism, and I write for her. I just wrote for an artist named Ryan Reynolds that is having a show there now. So as an art writer, you get to know gallery owners in helping them with catalog essays.
Ah, yes, right, right. Wonderful. John, listen, thanks so much for being here today. It's just really interesting and inspiring, and all the work you do. It's such a great contribution, really.
Thank you. And I really appreciate it. I'm excited to have your forward in the book because I feel like you got it. You understood the first book, and that made you ideal to write for the second one. So I appreciate your contribution to all of it.
Oh, well, it's just to be a small part of it is a huge deal. As we wrap up here, one question that I often ask artists, and you're no different. What's next for you? What's coming? What's the next thing?
I've been trying to work quietly on a super realist portrait of my youngest daughter. And I'm not quite failing. It's not as bad as I thought it was going to be, but I haven't worked on it for 2 weeks because I'm getting down to her eyes and her nose, and those things really matter. So it's kind of sitting there. And I think the next thing will be I'm going to pull out the brushes this weekend and see if, I can make a portrait that doesn't embarrass her or embarrass me. So that's what I'm working on currently.
Wow, that's so great. And we're not going to get a peek of that until it's done, right?
Absolutely no freaking way.
Okay, because I'm thinking
That's
I know
family
what
only.
image I'm going to ask for you once we're done with this podcast to include in that would make this interview different than all other interviews with you. Is this portrait of your daughter that's not quite done? But I get it. That boy, that's a tall order. You
I would get a
don't you don't
major
give
eye roll
yourself
from
easy
my daughter,
projects.
so no. Yeah. Well, always growing, always challenging myself. That's what art taught me
Yeah.
matters. And I know that you live that way too, so you understand.
Yeah, yeah. Well, listen, if I get down in your neck of the woods, I would love to come by. I forgot you were down in the Central Coast area. That's beautiful down there.
Thank you. My wife insisted on it, and I'm glad she did.
Yeah, yes. All right, my friend. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick. And thanks everybody who's been listening. Appreciate it.
Save the date because on September 20th, we'll be releasing the Art2Life podcast's 100th episode. And it's going to be kind of we have special things planned for it, and you won't want to miss it. We're going to be looking back at a bunch of there's so many artists, so many creatives, so many visionaries and thought leaders, and just chefs and all kinds of people that we have talked to over the past couple of years that I've had the pleasure of talking with. And so we'll be diving into some of that, some of the lessons learned, and then looking forward to what's coming. But I just want to thank you for being here all this time and sharing this with your friends and making this podcast into something that has become a huge part of my life and enriched a lot of others, folks that have been listening. So thank you for that. I will see you next week on the podcast next Wednesday. Thank you again. Okay, bye.